Welcome to This Constitution. I'm Matthew Brogdon, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. I've got Dr. Carol McNamara with me, who is the director of the Great Hearts Institute for Classical Education. Carol, welcome to This Constitution. Tell us just a little bit about the Great Hearts Institute for Classical Education and what you all do.
Well, the Great Hearts Institute for Classical Education is essentially a think tank dedicated to the study of and the discussion of classical education. And we gather together sort of several hundred, close to 800 people every year at our national symposium to talk about classical education, to discuss, to run workshops on pedagogy, curriculum, to bring in speakers who address the big ideas that are at the heart of classical education, keynote speakers. This year, our keynote speaker is Matthew Crawford, who is the author of Shop Class as Soulcraft and the importance of manual competence in the heart of education and classical education. So we're trying to provide a big tent event for everyone to gather and talk about the importance of improving K-12 education through a renaissance of the study of the great books and classical education.
And you're connected to a system of charter schools that started in Arizona. And of course, the Great Hearts Institute's in Phoenix.
That's right.
There's such a concentration of great resources there. The School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State, which is a great partner and peer to the Center for Constitutional Studies, is there at ASU, and you had an association with them. You were there at the foundation of SCETL, as we call it.
Yes.
And now you moved over to Great Hearts, and Phoenix has been the sort of ground zero for the expansion of a classical charter school movement that's had great purchase. I know in Arizona and Texas. Are there additional states that Great Hearts has expanded to now?
So the Great Hearts Academies started about 22 years ago, and they were really at the foundation of the sort of the beginning of classical public charter schools. That is providing a classical education that begins with, Frog and Toad and Aesop's Fables and goes all the way through the Socratic dialogues, the American founding, to the Brothers Karamazov in the senior year, and leading students through the Socratic method, teaching them how to study great books from beginning to end too, whole novels, whole works of history. This sort of education, there was a big demand even 22 years ago. And now, especially since COVID, there's a growing demand for excellence and the classics in K-12 education. So they started to create this classical charter public school system in Arizona. It's expanded really extensively in Texas, and now we have schools in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge. We have a K-5 that's expanding into 6-12 as well. And the sky's the limit. I think the demand for classical education is only going to grow as parents demand better education, better discussion, better study of books for their children.
I mean, sometimes we focus a lot on skills-based education. There's a lot of demand to educate students in specific skills oriented toward careers and that sort of thing. It seems like for a little while we gave short shrift in American education, especially American public education, to the reading of good books, the reading of an intellectual tradition that we've inherited that's about literature, moral philosophy, theology, art, architecture, and the way that those things create a civilization that supports something. Yeah. I mean, we study a constitution. We're a Center for Constitutional Studies, but I often tell people we have a capital C constitution, a form of government that we adhere to. But that constitution can only remain and endure because it's got a small c civic constitution under it that's part of our culture that supports it, and that constitution can successfully be part of. But the Constitution can't create a culture. It can't create a civilization. It assumes that we've already got a civilization that's committed to certain principles, values, shared ideas that give us a basis for living together.
Well, classical education is about the formation of the human person, and it involves the education of the mind through the study of ideas, through literature, moral philosophy, as you just said, but also teaching students how things move in natural science, how to count them, how to understand the universe through numbers and the observation of nature. So the study of ideas across the curriculum is what is the aim of classical education. And that understanding of what it is to be an educated human being is at the heart of classical education. But also there's the formation of the human, in addition to the formation of the human mind, is the formation of the human character. What makes a good person? What does it mean to be formed with ideas of virtue and civic virtue, human virtue, all the virtues that Aristotle discusses, for example, in the Nicomachean Ethics? These are all books that students at the classical Great Heart schools study and consider and discuss in their in their sort of humane letters seminars, for example.
And we tend to segment the pursuit of knowledge. I mean, the whole educational enterprise, especially true in college, but I think it pervades education right down to the beginnings of primary and secondary education as well. There's segmentation of the pursuit of knowledge and of truth into disciplines. That we're either doing science or we're doing humane letters or we're doing art,
right? As
though those are entirely distinct endeavors. I think something that classical education and the classical education movement has brought back to us is a realization that those are all ways of understanding what human beings are, how to live a good life, and how we relate to the world in which we live, including understanding that world. And it seems to me that putting together those different disciplines or pursuits back into a single pursuit of knowledge and a pursuit of truth. In fact, the classic formulation, classical schools are, of course, known for giving us back the tripartite pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness.
Right.
Not words we typically would hear when describing an undergraduate education or even our sort of systems of education now. So that seems immensely valuable.
It's interesting because when I talk to parents, they are concerned about their students graduating with what we might call marketable skills these days. But if you start to read about the tech industry, that's already starting to change. So if you're educated in tech or in IT, you are always going to have to be adaptable. You're going to have to be an adaptable learner. And the best way to become an adaptable learner is through a liberal education, an education that exposes you to the great ideas, to the study of the ideas that inform the Western tradition, the pursuit of the truth, the true, the good, and the beautiful, but also that make you an adaptable learner, that teach you how to learn, that teach you how to discuss and to understand how the world works and how we govern ourselves in American democracy, for example. And this forms not only American citizens, but also the leaders that American democracy needs for the future.
That's a great point, and brings us around to something that I want to talk about specifically. One of the things that I think very usefully put together that not only a classical education puts together, but your own scholarship puts together, is the way that thinking about something like government, which seems like a very practical art, right? We have a discipline of political science that thinks about government and how to structure it and how governments work and citizens behave. We can usefully put that together with literature, of all things. That is, what we think of as sort of distinct pursuits of the study of literature and the study of politics perhaps are not so separate. And your own scholarship focuses on Shakespeare. So I thought it'd be great for us to have a conversation about Shakespeare and how reading Shakespeare could, for the student or for the scholar or for the citizen or statesman, could inform our understanding of what a good government is and help us as we navigate politics. We primarily think of Shakespeare as a writer of literature, but your work tells us that Shakespeare is actually involved in something of a political project, I think you call it. So maybe tell us a little bit about Shakespeare's political project. What is Shakespeare up to?
Well, it's an interesting question because it is true that we read Shakespeare for the beauty of his language and his poetry and the stories about love. But it's also important to see that Shakespeare had a project, what I call a political project. And Shakespeare is living in England under an absolute monarchy. And he lives at a time, and I think it's important not to associate Shakespeare too closely with the politics of his time, but he's clearly living under an absolute monarchy, and he's observing the instability of that institution. So if absolute monarchy is unstable or unstable as a regime to govern human beings, how exactly should we govern human beings? And this seems to be Shakespeare's political project. If you study the English history plays, you see that he is studying the instability of the British monarchy, which at the time of Richard II is a monarchy by divine right. And we see how quickly and how easily that monarchy can be overthrown. And if you follow the English history plays through to Henry V, we see that even Henry V, whom Shakespeare depicts as maybe the apex of the British monarchy, is on the throne till he's a great king. He prepares himself through a careful education, living among the people, assuming the throne, and showing that he can be a great king, even though the expectations are so low. And then he has a great victory over France, and 5 years later, he's succumbed to dysentery. That demonstrates a kind of instability to the monarchy that you can't predict. And he leaves an infant son on the throne. And so Shakespeare starts to explore through his plays the study of alternative regimes, different kinds of ways that we can arrange ourselves and govern ourselves through republics, through empires and different forms, a commercial republic, in Venice, for example. So Shakespeare's political project is the quest to study the different ways that people govern themselves and whether those alternatives are viable for England and for humanity.
So what are some of his alternatives? You mentioned Venice. I know there's Shakespeare spends a lot of time with Rome. Probably if anybody learned anything about Shakespeare, it might have been Mark Antony's speech from Julius Caesar, right? Friends, right. Romans, countrymen. But Shakespeare writes extensively about Rome. Italy, he seems to love to put his plays in Italy and Italian city-states. So maybe sort of pick one and help me understand how Shakespeare uses some of these counterexamples to help us think about a better form of government than absolute monarchy.
You're right. He does look to the ancients for examples. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, which is a play we often go to see, which has the sort of form of a modern-day romantic comedy, he explores the idea of a mixed regime, of a mixed political organization where you have a leader and you bring in the people, the commoners, and you bring in the nobles, and you compel them or you arrange them in a way that they can all live together peacefully under a regime that is not an unstable monarchy. That's one example of him exploring the way to put together the different parts of the city into one political society that can live together more or less peacefully. Another example is his study of what you just referred to, the commercial republic in Venice, which claims to be a regime that transcends politics, that can put differences aside. Religious, in The Merchant of Venice, which is his most controversial comedy. It doesn't seem like a comedy, but in the end, nobody dies. But there, in Venice, through The Merchant of Venice, through Othello, he's looking at the ways in which a commercial republic can address the problem of difference. In Othello, you have a military man who is a Moor. How can he fit in to the commercial republican regime? Mm-hmm. Or in The Merchant of Venice, of course, you have Shylock, who is a Jewish moneylender. How can the regime accommodate that kind of different person? Mm-hmm. And Shakespeare it turns out from the way that these plays end, with Shylock converting to Christianity, being compelled to convert to Christianity at the end, or Othello's unfortunate demise, that these plays don't really, that there isn't evidence, or Shakespeare doesn't see the evidence that these plays can accommodate difference. So in a way, you could say that Shakespeare might have been very interested in the American experiment, where we try very hard and have mostly succeeded in accommodating and adapting to differences and including them in a way that prizes toleration. Sometimes lately we've been despairing over whether we can overcome our polarization, but I think that it's hard to find another way of life or another kind of Republican experiment or political experiment that has been as successful as the American one.
You know, that's a great point, that we sometimes forget how contingent and uncertain the whole American enterprise and having a diverse, especially a religiously diverse political society. Of course, we struggled with race mightily in American political history, but there have been examples of regimes living with racial and a degree of ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity. But religious difference has been such a pervasive problem, especially in the world of the founders. They, like Shakespeare, would have been looking at the experience of the Mediterranean, which coming out of the Middle Ages was rife with conflict between Muslims, as the term used in Othello as Moors, to describe Othello, but Muslims rooted in North Africa and the Middle East, and over into what we now call Eastern Europe, sort of fighting wars of conquest in Southern Europe, for a time ruling Spain and much of Italy. And then, there's sort of civilizational struggle between Islam and Christianity going on in many of those places. And of course, Jews caught in the middle quite often, as Shylock is. And then on top of that, we added the Protestant Reformation. Sometime around the 1500s and 1600s, we went through this process of now Christianity itself was going to have an internal division that was going to be very divisive. So the perspective of Shakespeare looking at the experience of Christians and Jews and Muslims in the Mediterranean world, and then the founders looking back at the experience of the Protestant Reformation, the solution to a lot of those seemed to be the regime would sort of pick one, right? You would have a Catholic regime in Spain, or you'd have a Protestant regime in the Netherlands. So where does Shakespeare find any hope, I guess, for solving that problem? I mean, he doesn't have the benefit of being able to look forward at the American founding. But does he give us any ground for hope that you can build some kind of political order that would solve that problem? Now, he himself sort of knows this. He lives in a Protestant country and his wife is Catholic, right? Is he married to a Catholic? Is that Shakespeare's story? Yeah. Or maybe it's that people sometimes argue that he was perhaps a closet Catholic.
No, the debates ensue about.
So maybe there's a personal struggle there too.
Everybody wants to claim Shakespeare as their own. And for me, none of that entirely matters, because what matters are the plays and the arguments in the play. I'm not sure that we could say that Shakespeare settles on one particular kind of regime, because I think he explores all of them. I think that he rejects, if we read Macbeth, we see that he rejects tyranny. For example, Lincoln said that Macbeth was the best play as far as he was concerned, because it explored this ambition, this tendency towards the desire to rule, and how